Our first author of the week is Mary Astle, and today she's widely known as an early feminist pioneer, but she was more than that in the 18th century. She was also known as a philosophical thinker, and her feminist reputation rests largely on her impassioned plea to establish an all-female college in England, an idea first put forward in her serious proposal to the ladies that she wrote in 1694. But she's also remembered for her harsh but witty indictment of early modern marriage in her Some Reflections Upon Marriage, which we'll be reading this week. But she, in her writings, she really looks at or really plays with some of the philosophical principles of the day, where she looks at women and rationalism, where she wants to teach her readers that all knowledge can be founded on reason rather than the senses, and urges them to practice these kind of Cartesian Descartes, I think therefore I am, but the Cartesian rules for thinking in order to attain knowledge of both moral and metaphysical truths. She also encourages women to regard their souls as thinking substances distinct from their bodies and as capable of attaining mastery over bodily sensations and passions. So really, she's a lot like some of her male counterparts in the age, where she is concerned about the truth, about knowledge, about objectivity, but a lot of that is overlooked by our audience, or our by a contemporary audience, because she's mainly known for these feminist writings. Mary Astle was born on November the 12th, in Newcastle, England, and she died in Chelsea on May 9th in 1731. She was the oldest of two children, and she belonged to a well-respected family with strong royalist leanings. The most important influence on her early intellectual development was her uncle, Ralph Astle, a clergyman poet who was educated at Cambridge in the mid-17th century, and under his tuition, it is likely that she gained a strong familiarity with Anglican theology. And he dies when she is 13, and soon after her uncle dies, her father unexpectedly dies, and her life takes a different trajectory and an unexpected turn. Because of her father's untimely death, her financial and social situation grew precarious, and her mother had to borrow money to keep the family afloat. And it seems that they could never have afforded a dowry for Mary, even if she had wanted to marry. Though there were rumors that Astle had once been engaged to a clergyman, she remained unmarried and childless all her life, choosing instead to lead the life of a writer. And part of she goes on to write several publications during her lifetime. Like I said, a proposal to women that she wrote anonymously under the name A Lover of Her Sex. But her most famous and most well-known publication is Some Reflections on Marriage, which was published in 1700. It is an essay, it is nonfiction, but these ideas and the kind of debate that she puts forward is going to make its way into our fiction pieces for the week. It is, like I said, her most popular feminist work, where she examines women's disadvantages within the early modern marriage state. And this work was ostensibly a response to Hortense Mancini's much publicized separation from her abusive and unstable husband, the Duke of Melray. And you can see right here in the first edition, she says some reflections on marriage occasioned by the case of the Duke and the Duchess Mazarin. So anyways, in this publication, she makes several claims, and one of those is that marriage is a trap, and that it would have been seen in the 18th century that women were the emotional, men were the logical, and they were always driven by their emotional responses. And Mary Astell says that they should be guided by reason. And that's not to say that Mary Astell was not a believer in marriage, that she didn't have a regard. I mean, even though she herself was unmarried, she does regard marriage as a sacred institution. But her complaints are that in her day, it is no longer this blessed state, but it is degenerated into an economic transaction. And in the reflections, her explicit purpose is to analyze why this degeneration has occurred and to see how it might be rectified. She traces the core problem to the moral failings of human beings. And remember, this is, again, another idea of the time where men are fundamentally flawed. Men meaning human beings, not men as in the male sex, but people are fundamentally flawed and they need to be improved. Anyways, she traces the problem to the moral failing of human beings, but more specifically to the failings of men in particular. She also highlights the fact that most men do not marry for love or benevolence toward women, but rather from base and selfish motives like lust and greed. She writes that marriage would be a happy state today if only human beings were guided by their reason and not by brutish passions. And she continues to warn women to be extremely wary of entering marriage in the first place, especially since she points to the fact that women and the wife are expected to offer blind submission even though he doesn't deserve it. And again, this kind of goes to challenge those kind of ideas established in the cult of womanhood. She goes on to kind of say that this expectation of submission might lead a woman to ignore the dictates of her reason, the law of God, and to act in terms of worldly self-interest instead. And as a result, an unhappy marriage to a vicious man could lead to the destruction of a woman's soul. And as a remedy, Astell once again highlights the necessity of a good education for women to fortify their reason, to cultivate their virtue. And had Hortense Mancini had the benefit of higher education in philosophy and religion, she suggests her husband's abuse might not have led to her moral degradation. So she does all of these things in some reflections on marriage. Please make sure that you read it carefully because she asks a couple of questions. She establishes that men marry for certain reasons and the like. And really, like I said, this is a nonfiction version that really establishes a lot of the kind of comments and themes and things for Roxana and the Cons of Marriage and William Hogarth and Marriage a la Mode. So stay tuned for the introduction to William Defoe in not William Defoe, Daniel Defoe in our next video, and also William Hogarth.